as discussed above, offers a powerful explanation for familiar features of L2 output. The utterance "a box bananas" looks as if it may have been the result of a strategy simplification leading to the omission of the functor "of" until its position in the discourse is considered. So when the student borrows the word "a box" and wants to say that there are bananas inside, the learner doesn't know that he or she needs to use "of." So the learner borrowed "a box" and then used "bananas." So this may be a leading factor to teach them the use of "of." And also, vertical constructions can explain why the no verb pattern is so common in early SLA. The learner simply adds "no" to a previous chunk of language, as in the example above. So when the learner wants to say "no" to something, the learner would just use "no" and put the verb or the ready-made chunk, the borrowed chunk, after "no," just to express the way they want to refuse. So the explanatory power of vertical constructions is increased by the notion of functions. Not only does the learner add to previously occurring chunks, but he also deletes and substitutes. Many of the features of the output can be explained as the result of the learner working on preceding utterances, his own or the native speakers, in various ways. So it is for this reason that the output should never be considered in isolation, but always in context, because that they use borrowed chunks. So when they try to make conversations, those borrowed chunks are not completed. Those sentences are made out of borrowed chunks without grammatical forms. So it should always be considered in context, in a whole. Third, frequency. Another way in which the structure of conversations can influence the route of SLA is by modeling specific grammatical forms, which are then subconsciously acquired by the learner. In other words, as you can see, the first structures the learner acquires are those to which he exposed most frequently. So the frequency of how the learner is exposed to can also be the factor of determining the order they acquire that grammatical form. As you can see, Hatch and Wagner Group reported a positive correlation between the frequency of various WH questions in the input and the order in which they are acquired. Larson-Freeman compared the standard morpheme order of SLA with the frequency of the same morphemes in the parental speech examined by Brown in his study of first language acquisition. She found a significant correlation. She comments, "Thus, the tentative conclusion is that morpheme frequency of occurrence in native speaker speech is the principal determinant for the oral production morpheme accuracy order of ESL learners." So when the learners are exposed more often to this specific WH questions, for example, if they learn what's more often than where, they are more likely to be to know more about how to use what questions instead of where questions to compare. So, however, such conclusions must be treated with caution. Lightbound argues that the statistical methods used can be misled. She found that the frequency of verb morphemes in the speech of grade 6 teachers in Canadian schools did not successfully predict the acquisition order of the same morphemes in communicative speech. But Lightbound hypothesizes that the frequency of input forms can have a delayed impact, which means Although it doesn't have a direct impact or does not successfully predict, but it still has a minor impact later on. That is, the input frequency in grade 6 is reflected in output frequency in grade 7. The relationship between input and output frequencies is an uncertain one. A significant correlation may simply reflect the fact that some structures naturally occur more frequently than others. Thus, the similarity between input and output frequencies may be coincidental and not indicative of any conscious teaching strategies. Moreover, it is not clear how input frequency can account for deviant utterance types in the output. It is possible that learners copy the ungrammaticalities they perceive in foreigner talk, but this has not been shown. So in other words, although learners can copy the frequencies, can learn from the frequencies of a foreigner talk, or they can still use those frequencies to learn, but it is still that there are still arguments about vice versa. Thank you.
And now I'll talk about the comprehensible input and 5 input and intake. First, sorry, my name is Winnie. And let's talk about the comprehensible input. 上一页. Yes. Okay, here's Crescent and Long. They argue that SLA is dependent on the availability of comprehensible input before the learner's processing mechanism can work. What is comprehensible input? Here's an example. A teacher asks student 1, how are you doing this morning? And student 1 say, I'm made. And then student 2 say, why? Teacher say, boy, yeah, why? Student 1 say, because this morning my father said no, have job this morning. Teacher say, your father has no more job this morning, or you have no job. Student 1 say, my father. That is comprehensible input. Then we'll talk about the Crescent arguments. He says he presents the case for comprehensible input in the form of input. And in form of the input hypothesis. What is hypothesis? It is only concerned with acquisition, not learning. And then he has the idea of I+1, and now we'll talk about the the author's idea. He said he puts much more emphasis on how input is made comprehensible. First is by the use of structures and vocabularies, which the learner already know. And number 2 is here and now orientation. Orientation is a strategy by using context information. And the third is the modification of the interactional structure of conversation. And though he think here and now orientation is the main source of comprehensible input. But there's some problems about their argument. Next, thank you. Okay, there's some problems. Larson, Fuhrman, and Trondheim and Swain, they think they much put emphasis on the outputs instead of input. The Swain, they have some several ways on output. First is the learner may be pushed to use alternative means where there is communication breakdown in order to express a message precisely, comprehensively, and appropriately. Number 2 is using the language metaphors of the learner to move from semantic processing, which is characteristic of the early stage of SLA. And number 3 is the learner has a chance to rest on hypotheses about the L2. All these arguments, they think and suggest that although it's important, but comprehensible input may not be either necessary or sufficient for SLA to take place. And now we'll talk about the inputs and intake. What is input? Input means the L2 data which the learner hears. And intake is portion of the L2 which is assimilated and fed into interlanguage system. And now Christian have some arguments about this part. He says I will just read the questions. Is it to do with the way pieces of input data are presented? And is it to do with social affective factors such as motivation? Christian argues that this acts as a filter. And he also thinks this is, for learners, this is not a response to the available data attend differently to features of the input. And there's other experts say they may attend this is Hatches says they may attend differentially to features of the inputs, using some to confirm or disconfirm existing hypotheses, others to form new hypotheses, and keeping others as saving, so that some trace remains which can be worked on later. And this discussion, how the input becomes intent necessarily, and it involves in a consideration of nature of the internal mechanism, such as we'll discuss later. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Lily. Now I'd like to talk about effects of input and interaction of the rate of SLA. And there have been a number of studies which have sought to investigate the effect of input and interaction on the rate of SLA. As these have all been concerned with classroom SLA, they also served to address the important question about the relationship between a classroom setting and SLA. For example, the Snow and Hofnagel examined the classroom inputs to 13 English-speaking learners of Dutch aged 3 to 18. They found that although teachers and some native-speaking children modified their speech when addressing the second language learners, neither the overall quantity of speech the learners were exposed to nor the quantity of the speech specially directed to either learners predicted the subsequent improvement in language ability of the different learners. And this study suggests that the quantity of comprehensible inputs in the classroom doesn't determine the rate of SLA. And the second researcher, Searger, in a study of adult classroom learners, he emphasized that those students who were high input generator in the classroom also capitalized on practice opportunities out of class. Thus, the evidence regarding the effect of quantity of input is mixed. And heading to Fearmore, he involved the composition of the classes and the type of organization. And Fearmore's study suggests that both the quantity and the quality of input are influential in determining the rate of SLA. And there are strong theoretical grounds for believing that a learning setting rich in these features will lead to successful SLA, but as yet there is little empirical proof. And now I'd like to talk about the empirical studies, which comes from Alice. And that suggests that following features are likely to facilitate repeat development. 1. A high quantity of input directed at the learners. Number 2. The learners perceived need to communicate in the second language. Number 3. Independent control of the propositional content by the learner, control over topic choice. Number 4. Adherence to the here and now principle, at least initially. 5. The performance of a range of speech acts by both native speaker, teacher, and the learner. 6. Exposure to a high quantity of directives. 7. Exposure to a high quantity of extending interests. 5. Opportunities for uninhibited practice. And last, I'd like to talk about summary and conclusion. I'd like to mix them up and by 3 questions. First, what characters are displayed by input and interaction involving second language learners? And at page 161, which from the summary, it mentioned, with regard to the root of SLA, input may facilitate development by providing the learner with ready-made chunks of language and memorize and later analyze, helping the learners to build vertical constructions, modeling specific grammatic forms with high frequency, ensuring that the input is one step ahead of the learner's existing knowledge, providing the right affect climate to ensure that input becomes intake. The characteristics of an optimal learning environment can be deduced from studies of input and interaction in both first and second language acquisition. And second questions are the characteristics of input and interaction related to SLA, and if so, in what way? Actually, we know much less about the second question. Strong claims have been advanced that SLA is aided by two means of interactional adjustments. However, two-way communication is not a necessary condition for SLA. And the last question, what are the different contributions of input and interaction on the one hand and the internal processing mechanism to SLA on the other? The third question is concerned. We are less sure. We do not know what proportion of responsibility to allocate to the linguistic environment as opposed to the internal mechanism. It may be that this question cannot be answered because SLA is jointly determined by factors inside and outside the learners. As Hatch writes, while social interaction may give the learner the best data to work with, the brain in turn must work out a fitting and relevant model of that input. This being so, it is an interactionist view of SLA, rather than a behaviorist or nativist view that may be most acceptable. That's all. Thank you.